Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the ReacTalk. Yeah, I'm a bit. Okay, I'm not a bit. I'm sick. Yes, I am going to be reacting to the complete history of the burning of Prospero Part 2, made on the Oculus Imperia YouTube channel. If you guys want to check out my previous reaction to Part 1, the playlist card is going to be at the top right here, as well as other Warhammer 40k content created by YouTubers, my reactions to them. And if you guys want to check out the original video as well as Oculus Imperia's YouTube channel, the links are going to be in the description below. Yes. Wow. In Part 1, Magnus the Red was told by the Emperor that, using his psychic abilities is forbidden henceforth from now on within the Imperium of Man. That includes his sons, that includes everyone else who has manifestation of psychic abilities in the Edict of Nicaea. The Emperor decreed that all psychers, part of the librarians, would have to disband and have to return back to their legions and operate like a normal legion, using a bolter, using melee weapons to fight and to wage war for the crusade. So Magnus was in a state of denial, if I can say that, where he believed that the Emperor did not include him in this judgment of the Edict of Nicaea. He believed that he could correct his father's decision by showing his abilities, by showing his loyalty, by informing the Emperor of Horus Lupercal's betrayal. By doing so, he destroyed the wards protecting Terra from the Imperia. He destroyed the Webway project that the Emperor was working on in his dungeon by entering into his facility and into the Webway using psychic astral projection of himself. And the Emperor, of course, was angry. He was disappointed in his son, and he requested the censure of Magnus the Red and his entire legion, the 15th Legion, the Thousand Sons. The censure host was initially led by Constantine Valdor, but of course the command and supreme authority will be handed over to the Emperor's son. It was the 6th Legion, the Space Wolves, led by Leman Russ. And Leman Russ has, he hates his brother, he hates Magnus the Red, he hates his legion, he sees them as weaklings, he sees them as dishonorable people, and he needed an excuse to unleash his legion and unleash himself upon the 15th Legion and their Primarch, Magnus the Red. And Horus Lupercal gave him that reason, gave him that authority to do so, even though it's against the Emperor's command that the censure host is only going to apprehend Magnus the Red and arrest also the 15th Legion and bring Magnus back to Terra. But Horus Lupercal and Leman Russ have other ideas, and they wish to eliminate Prospero, eliminate the 15th Legion, and eliminate Magnus the Red. And the censure host itself consists of very powerful units, from all the way from the Sisters of Silence to the Side Titans to the 6th Legion Space Wolves, many other auxiliary forces, the Mechanicus, as well as some Titans are also going to be participating in this censure. But basically, the forces that are assembled, does not seem like something that's going to be used to arrest Magnus the Red, but it seems like it is a force that is going to be used to destroy Prospero, because the censure host has overwhelming force, and This was supposed to be an arrest, not the elimination of the 15th Legion and Magnus the Red. So that's where we are right now, after part 1. And now we're entering into part 2 of the story. And let us see what happens to Prospero and the conduct of the censure host. Yeah. 3, 2, 1, go.
As the censure host of the Emperor cleaved a path through the tides of the Imperia, powering at full wake towards the planet of Prospero, homeworld of the 15th Legion, Magnus the Red sat ensconced within his sanctum. Around him, throughout the capital of Tizca, were gathered the overwhelming majority of his 1,000 sons. Yet the potent and of course condemned collection of Astartes were not, as the ships of Russ and Valdor powered ever closer, fortifying their home against invasion. They were, instead, obliviously tending to their studies and initiatives, training their bodies and minds for whatever expedition they anticipated their Primarch was surely preparing to lead them upon. Should any acolytes wonder as to how a legion possessed of literal prescience have been able to be caught by surprise, let alone remain unalerted by entirely mundane communication apparatuses, know that it is simply because they were all of them deceived. Magnus the Red appears to have been fully aware that his judgment was nigh, approaching now with slavering jaws, and he made every effort possible to conceal this from his sons, and indeed almost ease the approach of the fleet.
I wonder why would he do that exactly, Why not inform your sons that, there's a censure host coming to Prospero. They've come here to arrest me. And it is because of my actions as Primarch. I wonder why didn't he tell his sons the truth? Or maybe he's ashamed of what he has done. Yeah, maybe he's embarrassed that he has done such a terrible mistake and that the Emperor himself has ordered this censure against him. Yeah.
What scant records of the Legion, as captured and archived by the Legio Custodes, dictate that the Primarch issued no defensive preparation orders. Instead, he withdrew honor guard and watch garrisons from the world that lay in the path of the censure host, shuttering all holdfasts of the Legion that could potentially deliver any advance warning. Similarly, the fleet of the 1,000 Sons was broken into dozens of separate squadrons and dispatched to far more distant Legion outposts, or on unclear patrol routes that would take them into the deep void and as far from the orbit of their homeworld as possible. The astropathic choirs of Prospero were removed from their chambers, records of their recent communiques redacted, and in some cases the minds and memories of the telepaths themselves altered to remove information deemed sensitive.
Since Magnus the Red can see into the future, I'm wondering whether he saw his own demise, or his people's demise at the hands of Leman Russ and the censure host. I'm wondering whether he actually saw that possible future, and maybe that's the reason why he's acting this way, to make it seem as if he has surrendered. He will come quietly. There won't be any need for any battles or conflict on the planet, and he would just avail himself to the censure host. Maybe that's why he made sure that this information was kept from his sons. Yeah.
All of these measures were made explicitly by the order of Magnus. Indeed, the informational aspect appears to be crucial, as by throttling all incoming off-world missives, Magnus managed to prevent his sons from not only discovering that their doom approached, but that the Emperor had even censured him in the first place. None save the members of the Rehati, his inner circle, even knew of the ritual Magnus had attempted, and it is unclear if any were even aware of the results, or what had transpired as the spirit form of the Primarch had flown to Terra. Magnus clearly went through great lengths to disguise his failure from the 1,000 Sons, even going so far as to alter the memories of those he deemed a threat to its revelation. The motivations of the Crimson King for this are, of course, only open to supposition. Some will claim that it was his means of surrendering to the oncoming judgment, while others will state it was guilt and shame that drove his hand, a mad rush to conceal the truth from his sons until the last possible moment, as he sought martyrdom as penance for his crimes. Official Terran chronicles, compiled in the aftermath of the Great Heresy, stated categorically that it was by the will of the Emperor alone that his traitorous son and his brood had their sight stripped from them.
I don't know how possible that is. I mean, yes, the Emperor is powerful, but at that time he was focusing on preventing demons from, entering through the webway, hole that was created by Magnus. So he's holding that back with his psychic powers. I don't think he has, more energy to also blanket Prospero and all the 15th Legion's psychers from seeing what was coming to the planet. I don't think the Emperor is that powerful. Not yet. Not yet.
And while one may admire the fervor behind such a statement, it is unlikely that it was anything other than propaganda. Yet, for all their obliviousness, a Legion homeworld was to never be considered an easy target, and Prospero was now host to the majority of the Legion it had borne, as well as auxiliaries of the Prosperine Spire Guard regiments and the subterranean Mechanicum Enclave from the local forge world of Shao-Arcad. All of these were contained within the mighty capital of Tizca, with the exception of the Mechanicum Forge Fane, for without lay the wastes of a world overrun with predatory Xenos megafauna, the most lethal amongst them being the deadly Psychnoian. The ancient cities of pre-fall Prospero were nothing more than time-worn ruins, occasionally occupied by training outposts of the Legion or heavily defended scientific endeavors. Nothing more. It was not outside the central metropolis for an enemy to capture or destroy.
So, the entire planet of Prospero only has one major city, and that's and that's Prospero itself, the capital. I mean, okay, interesting.
Xenos infestations made such a possibility of establishing any forward operating base for a traditional siege completely impractical. Even if a foundation for such a holdfast could have been emplaced, constant predation would have drained vital resources of the censure host, now apparently set in its aim of a full-scale military invasion. Such losses would be ill afforded. The capital itself presented no easy task for any that wished to attack it, as it had been specifically constructed within a geographically isolated location. To the north of it lay the White Mountains, impassable to most any army and strung through with defense batteries and fortified bunkers providing overlapping fire cover on any potential approach. To the west was the Valpurine Sea, its tides naturally preventing any assault from that vector. The only conventional land approach to the city had long ago been clad behind 100-meter-tall walls.
I made a mistake. I said Prospero, a capital, when it's actually Tizca, right? Yes. Sorry about that. The city of Tizca reminds me of the Assyrian Empire. I don't know if you guys know of your history of the Assyrian Empire on Earth. The Assyrian Empire had three major powerful cities: Nimrud, Nineveh, and Ashur. Ashur was the religious capital, Nineveh was the capital, and Nimrud was the military capital. And all of these cities had ziggurat pyramids. And what I'm seeing here with Tizca reminds me of the documentaries I've been watching centered around the Assyrian Empire, how they also built pyramids, but for their gods, essentially. And here you can see in Tizca, they've also built these pyramids that, look like cities themselves. The pyramids are huge. They have, buildings inside the pyramid, if I can say that. So it's like a city within a city. Yeah. Pretty amazing. Pretty cool.
Embedded with void shield generators to ward off the Psychonoian. Tizca had always been a fortress by sheer necessity, the last bastion of humanity upon a hostile world. The coming of the Legion had only refined and upgraded this, and, given the Thousand Sons' proclivities, this went far, far beyond void shield and turbolaser batteries.
It is to be expected since they are psychers, so I would expect some sort of archaeotech, psyker archaeotech that is also being used to defend the city. So yeah, I would expect that the 15th Legion would also use psyker technology to not only defend their homeworld but also for the crusade. Yeah.
Its skyward vector was protected by a giant telekinetic barrier, designed to channel the power of Raptora cult Astartes and enhance it by orders of magnitude. It formed what was essentially a biologically and etherically generated void battleship equivalent barrier, one that required no power beyond the mental fortitude of those who were delegated to maintain it.
This reminds me of Stellaris. I don't know if you guys play Stellaris, but there is a technology that you can research in Stellaris where you can acquire shields, psychic shields, shields that are powered by people with, psychic minds, essentially, and also side jump drives, where, a psyker or someone with psychic abilities can use their, foresight to allow the ship to jump far further than any other traditional jump drive, essentially. So yeah, it's kind of taking me back to Stellaris with their side shields and side jump drives. Yeah, that's cool.
While technically the usage of such powers was banned under the Edict of Nicaea, the commanders of the censor host were under no doubt that the Legion would immediately utilize it if placed under threat, and had included it in their assault planning. These commanders were painfully aware that this was merely one of the potentially dozens of esoteric and paranormal defenses that the Thousand Sons could mount at any moment. The cult arcologies of the city were gigantic and could form perfect loci for defensive efforts. And as to what lay within the warren of buildings that formed the Old Quarter and other parts of the conurbation, no Terran official could warrant any suppositions.
But imagine all of this knowledge, all of this technology. It could have been beneficial for the Imperium of Man. This Psi shield, really, it could have been such an advantage for any Imperium of Man settlement. Even Terra would be protected by such a powerful, psychic shield. And all of this technology, all of this knowledge is going to be burnt. It's insane. It's insane.
These issues with forming a planetary assault would have, under normal circumstances, necessitated a far longer period of planning, or a different configuration of the attackers, or sundry other applications of military logistics and strategizing. But we must remember one crucial aspect above all else when it comes to considering how the censor host began its opening gambits. It had been formed, originally, to be an honor guard under arms, not explicitly, at least, as a hostile military expedition in any real sense. Perpetrating an invasion in force was a last resort, an eventuality Legio Custodes' genetic programming forced them to consider in every situation they engaged with. Horus Lupercal, and to an extent Leman Russ, had manipulated the events to transform an escort fleet into an assault flotilla, and while the former had swelled its offensive capabilities with the addition of Sons of Horus Astartes, War Master pledged Exertus Imperialis regiments, and the god engines of the Legio Mortis, they were still ranged against an entire Astartes legion. While no efforts had been made, since they were not necessary, to conceal Prospero's capabilities, there was a significant difference in being able to ascertain the serving number of Prosperine Spire Guard to, say, accurately plotting out just what technologies the Mechanicum of Shao Arcad held in their underground fane.
Look, even with their forces that they have, I just think it's just simply overwhelming in terms of the Central Host. The variety of different regiments and forces that they have at their command is just simply overwhelming. You know, there are units that are specifically tasked to nullify the abilities of Psychers, and that is the Sisters of Silence. You have some of the best hand-to-hand combat specialists in the galaxy, and you know they're wearing Auramite armor, golden Auramite armor, and that is the Custodians. And then you have the Psi Titans, where I've stated before that you only need one to take over an entire civilization, but they've brought 5 to this planet. And then you have all the other auxiliary forces, and then you have Titans, and then you have the 6th Legion and of the Space Wolves, and then you have Lehman Russ as well. So, yes, Prospero has a lot of forces. Oh shit! Sorry. Oh, that hurt. Yes, Prospero has a lot of forces. You know, they have the Spire Guard, but it is simply not enough. Not enough. They're going to be overwhelmed.
Or just how effective the psychic might of the Thousand Suns would be should they decide to unleash it. In short, even supplemented by the War Master's forces, even with the auric might of the Legio Custodes, the anti-psyker specialities of the Silent Sisterhood, and the terrifying power of the Titans of the Ordo Sinister, the equation that was the balance of power was far too close to parity for any commander to be comfortable with.
Yeah, I'm not like other commanders. I see what I see, and I see this as an overwhelming force. I don't see them being at any level equal to each other. That's why I'm saying that even if Prospero prepared itself for an invasion from the Central Host, there are simply just too many forces in a variety of specialized combat that are designed specifically to target Psychers, that are designed specifically to demolish defenses, that are designed specifically to overwhelm enemy combatants with sheer force and ferocity and power. And you could also say the 6th Legion is part of that. You know, they can be relentless. The 6th Legion, like we've always been told, is the attack dog of the Emperor. You know, what does that tell you? What does that tell you?
Typically, orbital invasions predicated themselves around numerical superiority as the absolute base element, all the better to eliminate the home field advantage possessed by entrenched defenders. This, the Censor Host completely lacked, and that is before anything else was taken into consideration, such as the psychic powers of the Thousand Suns or that of their Primarch. While the Censor Host was making unimpeded progress towards Prospero, sustaining nothing in the way of delays, let alone losses, and was thus able to count on their arrival in full force, they nevertheless expected the enemy to quickly adapt to any outbreak of hostilities, counting not on the fact that they were seemingly arriving with total surprise on their side. And it was best they did, for the defenses ranged against them were formidable indeed, even for all their lack of preparation. At the pinnacle, figuratively and literally, was Magnus the Red, withdrawn in seclusion, but remaining the supreme authority over all that transpired under Prosperine skies. Outside of the Legion, but still beholden to Magnus, were Magus Prime Tacitus Proctor of the Arcadian Mechanicum fane, whose heresy technologica had been declared by Mars at the same time the censure of Magnus had been announced, Lucretia Elunarai, Seneschal Prime of the Prosperine Spireguard regiments, and Calvalar Ibranum, Princeps Warden of the Vigil of the Legio Zestobiax Titans, stationed planetside. While these latter were present in force, and were served as potent auxiliaries, the bulk of Prospero's might was absolutely maintained within the 15th Legion, There, in its vast majority, some 62,000 Astartes out of an estimated 80 to 90,000. The First Fellowship, indeed, were present in its entirety, 9,000 Astartes, including the whole of the Legion's Terminator elite. The remaining 8 fellowships varied in disposition, with only the fourth being severely underrepresented, a mere 200 Astartes, with the rest off-world abroad across the galaxy. Outside the bounds of the fellowships, the Order of Ruin possessed 1,800 Astartes and nearly 800 battle automata of the psychically sensitive Castellax Achaea pattern. The Order of the Blind were a round 888 Astartes withdrawn from their secretive operations galaxy-wide, and the Order of the Jackal supplemented their legion with 604 Astartes that could be withdrawn from their ceremonial and practical legion management duties. Of the auxiliaries, strength therein was nothing to be sniffed at, regardless of the transhuman fury they were about to face. The Spire Guard counted 85,000 soldiers under arms, a combined arms force arrayed along standard Exertus Imperialis lines, but considered within its upper echelons in terms of training, quality of equipment, and discipline.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I'm overlooking the mortal human forces, the auxiliary citizens, militia regiments, or the Spire Guard. I'm sorry that I'm overlooking them, but this is going to be clearly an Astartes, or should I say a superhuman affair, because we're dealing with Astartes, we're dealing with the Custodians, we're dealing with the Sisters of Silence, we're dealing with forces that are mechanized. I just don't see how the Spire Guard and the citizen militia regiments are going to fare up against these types of forces, because they're probably not going to be dealing with the auxiliary forces of the Censure Host. They're going to be dealing with the superhumans of the Censure Host first. And like I've said before, the Custodians are terrifying. The Astartes of the 6th Legion are terrifying. They commence xenocides. It's their speciality. They're good at their job. And I'm just not really impressed enough with the amount of human, militias or auxiliary forces that are available on Prospero. It's simply not going to be enough. Yeah. I have doubt. And since I already know what happened to Prospero, my assertions are correct. Oh gosh.
The Arcadian Mechanicum counted a typically diverse and fractious set of tagma amongst its presence planetside, but could, if required, form a tagmata consisting of 8,000 soldiers and automata, as well as attached esoteric war machines. Finally, a full vigil of the Legios Estobiacs was also present. 12 Titans of various configurations contained within the Geller and void-shielded Mechanicum Fane just outside the city limits. These were the considerations as the Censure Host slipped anchor at Beta Garman and made the months-long journey from the Coreward reaches towards Prospero. However, what they found, both along the route and as they drew closer, surprised them. As mentioned earlier, not only were the outposts of the Thousand Suns vacated, but not a single picket craft, defense monitor, or lone roving frigate was even encountered. Ironically, this only increased the combat readiness of the host, translating in-system at each necessary staging point in staggered formations that would allow for rapid retreat through the Mandeville Point. No explanation could be offered for the dearth of 15th Legion vessels, and when the time had finally come to breach the bounds of Prospero's own system, the host did so as tentatively as possible, sending a formation of Silent Sisterhood Anathema-class Pinnace and a flotilla of 6th Legion interdiction destroyers far ahead of the main fleet. Surely, most host commanders believed, the Thousand Suns had gathered the full might of their fleet in orbit around their homeworld. But no. Within the light of Prospero's sun was found the same situation as every other leg of the Censure Host's journey. Not a single ship under the 15th Legion flag was detectable on any Auspex sweeps. Indeed, the only craft in system were the typical merchant vessels common in all Imperial space, and approximately 24 monitor vessels aligned to the Mechanicum forge of Shao Arcad, none of which were even warp-capable. Without a trace of any Legion vessels, the sensor host delayed its arrival in force, fearing an ambush of some kind. Nearby systems were scouted for the 15th Fleet, and all merchant shipping was rapidly seized, with their crews turned over to the silent Sisterhood interrogatrixes for debriefing.
Debriefing.
The idea that the fleet was simply dismissed by Magnus did not even enter into the considerations of Russ and Valdor at the time. For what possible reason could there be for such a decision? One wonders what these august figures would make of it, to know that even 10,000 years later, the reason for this is still a mystery that weighs heavy upon those who chronicle it.
Like the Emperor, Magnus they are very confusing characters. The decisions they make just sometimes don't make any sense. And what makes it worse is that they don't explain themselves. They just do it because they believe they are right.
All due caution was paid to the possibility that, through means either mundane or arcane, Magnus had disguised his fleet's presence. The Mechanicum ships, whose commanders were all Prosperi natives, were rapidly seized by 6th Legion boarding actions, the Wolves moving professionally and fairly bloodlessly to capture their crews intact. While no match for the battleships of the host, these craft were deemed both a threat of note enough, due to their macro cannon batteries, that they could disrupt landing operations, but also for the potentially sensitive information their crews could be aware of. One such capture, that of the monitor sloop Tempest, is often highlighted by those who seek to criticize prevailing opinions of the Wolves' rather bloodthirsty nature. Only 64 members of the ship's crew were killed in her capture, and only one Astartes was lost on the Imperial side, ironically enough the first casualty of war for the entire burning of Prospero, on those who went under the Emperor's flag. A single wolf was slain by the ship's captain, who himself was dispatched along with the entirety of the bridge crew subsequently. The remaining personnel on board were informed by the attackers that they were to surrender, or all life support would be immediately turned off. The pattern was repeated system-wide, with all non-sensor host-aligned ships being immediately seized. Unfortunately for the commanders, the Mechanicum appeared to be just as in the dark as they were. None of the surviving Magi were capable of offering any explanation as to the disappearance of the Thousand Suns fleet, never mind their surprise at seeing themselves being captured by those who were apparently on the same side as them.
That's the thing with the Imperium of Man. Yes, you belong to this umbrella organization called the Imperium of Man, but anytime your world could be, decided that your world is a threat to the Imperium of Man, or, there is chaos on your world and it needs to be exterminated, thus leading to your entire planet suffering the consequences, and really, in the Imperium of Man, there are no true allies, there are no true friends here. They will kill you. If the orders come from high enough officials or even the Emperor himself, they will censure for your extermination. So it doesn't matter that you're a citizen of the Imperium of Man. If they can deem you as a threat, if you are in association with this threat in any sort of way, you will also be killed just for a security measure. The entire world will have to be eradicated, or the entire populace of a community will have to be eradicated. And that's just the way it is in the Imperium of Man. Your life is not important. Not enough. Yeah.
With no choice but to act, Russ gave the order for full fleet translation. First came the heavy cruisers and the battleships, spreading out across the Prosperine orbital reaches and neutralizing its satellite communications network and weapons platform arrays, although the latter proved to be far less of an issue than anticipated. Not a single shot was fired in return as the platforms were sundered from the skies. The transport barks and Titan macro conveyors translated in shortly thereafter, directly into high anchor. Prosperine space had been seized in the matter of a few hours. The sensor host was in complete and uncontested control of the orbital volume. That an Imperial planet, and a Legion homeworld no less, had fallen in such time was unthinkable, a travesty and a tragedy in kind, all that defensive artifice of Imperial genius, that it could be stripped aside so easily, even by those who had made it. That they had surely speaks volumes to the degree that Magnus the Red had sought to pave the path forward for this censure host. Since their departure from Beta Garmin to their complete mastery of Prospero's skies, not a single shot had been fired at their approach, not in warning nor in anger. Upon the surface, the host's sudden arrival was now becoming known, but not in anything approaching a coherent fashion. The destruction of the communication grid had wrought havoc on the planet's civilian government, and the rain of satellite debris that was now plummeting from the atmosphere only added to this. Several regiments of the Spire Guard, lacking direct command and with their Vox networks in chaos, began to mobilize, their commanders assuming that an invasion was, somehow, already underway. Elsewhere, Tizca's emergency responders were deploying, assuming an entirely different scenario, that there had been some form of orbital catastrophe, and their services would soon be needed. The Thousand Sons were utterly silent in their cult arcologies. Not a single member of the Legion's senior staff could be raised on the Vox, and what contact existed between civilians and Astartes of the line only proved that the lower ranks would absolutely not budge without direct orders to do so.
I wonder what is going on, really. Yes, Magnus the Red is paving the way for the censure host, but to not inform your Astartes to be on the ready just in case should anything happen. Wow. He really wanted to make Prospero seem as passive as possible, to the censure host, that they are no threat to them. Yeah.
It has been suspected, based on writings recovered, that the Legion was now beginning to realize something was afoot, although if they were, they made no show of it. In orbit, Leman Russ took one final step to avoid the end he had, by some estimates, already concluded would occur. He offered clemency for the world, in exchange for the Primarch.
I'm surprised. I am surprised. I thought he was going to immediately just start attacking, but no, he's giving them an ultimatum, a chance. Hand over Magnus, and we will leave Prospero alone. Okay, Leman Russ.
From the flagship of the Legio Custodes, the appointed Vox Imperiosa, voted voice of the Sisters of Silence, proclaimed again the writ of censure that the Emperor himself had declared months previously. The Crimson King was to surrender himself for transportation to Terra. The communique was delivered on all bands, civilian, military, and astropathic. There was no response. Russ's ire began to build. He is recorded to have spent a standard hour pacing the bridge of his flagship, fury kindling, requesting updates from his master of Vox repeatedly, only to be told the same each time. There was no response.
Then you go down to the planet with your personal guard, with Constantine Valdor and his Astartes, custodians, and the Sisters of Silence and their, most powerful sisters. You head directly to the pyramid where Magnus is, holding himself, and go and drag him out of there, clapped in iron. It doesn't have to resort to commencing a war across the entire planet, and killing the citizens of Tesca. Go directly to the planet. Since they have not attacked you, or they have not mobilized their forces against the Center host, it is safe to assume that they are not going to attack you if you land directly on the spot where Magnus the Red is being held up, in one of those pyramids. Do that. Go open those doors, clap him in irons, and take him out. If there is resistance, then yes, defend yourselves.
Valdor raised the Primarch, cautioning him against rash action and requesting that Magnus be given more time, as the censure proclamation was obviously one of great import. There was not. There was no word of resigned surrender. There were no pleas of forgiveness. There was no staunch resistance or hot-headed hostility. There was not even acknowledgement that the fleet was even there. Russ had had enough, and Prospero began to burn. To any who may believe that the appellation burning is a poetic one, let me disperse any notions thus.
They mean literal burning.
Forthwith. The literal burning of Prospero began as soon as Russ gave his command. From the bowels of the 6th Legion fleet came a barrage of the world-killer weapons of Beta Garmin. Viral cascades emulsified all biological life upon the planet, while land strikes ignited gaseous aftermaths, creating firestorm deluges that incinerated whole continents. The verdant wilderness of Prospero vanished in fire and ash, a biosphere so redolent of old Earth, now lost to the punitive fury of Leman Russ and his wolves. It only took an hour. Yet, when augury suites scried the burning world, one thing was incontrovertible. Tizca had survived, unblemished, the sole area unscathed in a world aflame, and doing so under a shimmering aegis of psychokinetic force. Clearly, at the last instance, the rage of the 6th Legion had been detected by the Thousand Suns, whose adepts had rushed to raise their unique shield above the capital. In doing so, almost ironically, they had damned themselves even further. Whatever their desire to protect their city, their home, their civilians, they had done so through clearly arcane means.
I mean, like, what choice do they have? What choice do they have? They have to protect their home. They have to protect their home from this exterminatus campaign against them. They have no choice but to further break the Edict of Nicaea and use this shield. I don't blame them. I don't blame them.
Not even a Gloriana-class battleship's shields could have withstood the bombardment that rained down on Prospero. Here, then, was evidence incontrovertible that the 15th Legion shared their father's crimes, that the Emperor's Edict of Nicaea had been truly violated, and before the watching eyes of those who bore the Magisteriae Imperator, too. It seems so petty a thing, at this juncture, to have guilt pronounced upon those who were literally enduring an orbital bombardment for crimes they had not even known they were accused of, but such are the curious twists of history. It is true, however, that up until the survival of the metropole of Tizca, it had not been proven that the Thousand Suns yet continued to utilize their powers. Observing the shield from orbit, Russ and Valdor had been handed evidence entirely to the contrary. It had, of course, always been assumed that no orbital attack would scour the planet completely of the Legion. Exterminatus can be, oddly enough, an imprecise tool within the Imperium's arsenal, especially when the Legiones Astartes are concerned. Russ and Valdor managed...
You can think about what happened to Istvan III and the betrayal of the legions on that planet, how they, some of those Astartes who were betrayed survived the exterminatus of Istvan III. They went into bunkers, they went into underground facilities that could protect them from the ravages of the exterminatus weapons on the surface. So yes, it is not 100% foolproof against Astartes, especially if circumstances are available where the Astartes can take cover and wait it out, like the Astartes who were in the Istvan III betrayal. So yeah, it's not 100% accurate, but it is, extremely devastating to a planet and its environment.
To correctly assume what Horus Lupercal did not, years later, at Istvan III, although both would be stunned by just how many of those they had subjected to the punitive bombardments had managed to weather them. The censure host now faced not a punished legion reeling from an attack unexpected, but a resolved and dug-in opponent whose numbers were almost exactly 1-to-1 with their own. The bombardment had only served to set the defenders' home ablaze. It had not reduced their capabilities one iota, something the sensors of the fleet were now clearly detecting as the Prosperine Spire Guard rushed to their fortifications around the Acropoli of Tizca, unfurling defense lasers and establishing barricades and readouts. Of the Thousand Suns themselves, however, still nothing was seen. The orbital strikes had, of course, not accomplished nothing. In the mountains surrounding the city, Lance strikes had disabled many of the orbital and air defense batteries, unprotected by the shield as they were, and had set avalanches of snow and rock plummeting into the civilian quarters of Tizca. The Valpurine Sea had likewise endured punishment that had sent tsunamis to pound the coastal quarters of the capital, as well as clouds of scalding mists from superheated water boiled by lance beams. As the Spire Guard were rushing to defend against what was now clearly an invasion, they had to battle their way through crowds of panicked, fleeing civilians, as well as aid the overwhelmed civil defense units in coordinating evacuations and crowd control. The Legion was still nowhere in sight, and though they were clearly aware of an invasion owing to the raising of the Kinney Shield, their silence, and that of Magnus, only worsened matters as civilian government order completely broke down, bereft of the leadership they had come to rely on from the Astartes. Chaos was reigning, and while the Spire Guard were engaging in admirable efforts to mitigate it, the situation was only growing worse. No word, likewise, could be raised from the Mechanicum. Their forge fane was a subterranean one, but it was located outside of reach of the shield. What surface facilities it had once borne had simply vanished, scoured from the earth by the guns of the host. All Strategoi officers aboard the fleet advocated an immediate drop en masse to Tizca itself. The destruction wreaked by the bombardment rendered all landing zones outside of the city useless, not to mention that any army would then have to contend with the walls of the metropolis and the still very much active Kinney Shield. Russ, however, gainsayed part of this order. He had, by all accounts, sworn a form of oath that he and his wolves would be the first boots on the ground. Despite the protests of all other host command officers, including Valdor, Russ ordered that all non-Astartes combatants of the Censure host remain in orbit until he and his legion had established a beachhead.
You see what I mean when I said that, yes, the forces protecting Tizca are formidable, but it simply won't be enough when it comes to a legion that specializes in in total complete warfare and exterminating entire races. It's just not going to be enough. And since they are the first ones to land on the planet, it's going to be extremely devastating for the defensive forces or the local forces of Tizca. And to add further, issue or problem to this situation, Magnus has not allowed his Astartes to take defensive positions around the city. So essentially it's just human auxiliary forces who have to contend with the Space Marines. And that outcome is going to be terrible.
And immediately set about gathering the might of On, his legion's first company, and the most bellicose of his assault cadres for an immediate landing in force, this consisting of warriors of the 2nd, 3rd, 8th, and 12th companies. At 0758 local Tizkin time, on 743004 M31, the first 6 Legion aircraft broke the atmospheric boundaries of Prospero. In a fashion perfected by the Wolves for aerial assault of dug-in enemies, their approach dive was taken at such a speed and descent angle that it would have literally killed unaugmented humans, with the aircraft leveling out of the dive over the still boiling Valperine Sea, mere meters above the angrily tempestuous waves, slamming ramjets to their limits as they burned towards the Tizkin shoreline. Such an approach mitigated the vast majority of potential anti-aircraft fire volumes, something which the Wolves, unaware of the Spire Guard's hastily established batteries, had not realized was ultimately unnecessary. The response that came from the Prosperine was in the form of scrambled air interdiction fighters, Arcadian-patterned Lightning and Thunderbolt aircraft from the fields that had been protected by the Tizkin Kinney Shield. The pilots, brave as they were, had of course never been called upon to face the Legionnaires Astartes, and followed standard engagement protocol with presumed enemy dropships, namely, that they presumed them to be ill-equipped to defend themselves. They were of course quite the opposite. Prospero
You would expect the Thousand Suns to teach the auxiliary forces on Prospero, about the technologies that they use to wage war in the Great Crusade. You would expect the Spire Tower regiments to be knowledgeable on the types of weaponry systems that Astartes bring to the battlefield. But I guess such information is kept secret from the mortal forces, and it's only kept available for Astartes.
Rhine aircraft on approach vectors found their planes shredded by deluges of heavy bolt fire, or plucked from the sky by pinpoint las cannon shots. One Lightning suffered a head-on collision with the Legion Stormbird, obliterating it in its entirety as the Astartes craft continued on completely unscathed. The Prosperine only got to make one pass. As the air guard banked around for a second potential run, they were set upon immediately by the Xiphon interceptors of the Wolves, supported by a small number of Legio Custodes Equinox fighters running aerial support and reconnaissance, cognizant of the oath Russ was insisting on maintaining.
Air defense is gone. What's next?
The interdiction was so one-sided it would have been laughable had it not been tragic. Astartes and Custodes aircraft isolated individual Prosperine fighters from their squadrons with ruthless efficiency, completely occupying the air guard in what had become nothing less than a fight for survival, as the baseline humans of the defenders pitted their piloting against the transhuman mastery of the invaders. The lander craft continued on towards the city, freed from what little interference the air guard had been even able to run, grounding themselves at pre-selected landing zones along the immediate coastline. The Stormbirds formed a concentric ring, a tactic pioneered by the Wolves of Russ for orbital landings, as it allowed the massive aircraft to merge their void shields in a manner not entirely dissimilar from the hunting packs of Warhound Scout Titans. The protective bubble was immediately useful, as ranging artillery strikes from the Spire Guard began to almost immediately fall. Just as he had so sworn in orbit, the first warrior of the Censure host to disembark was Leman Russ himself, doing so with no words of rousing wisdom or assured conviction, but with a bestial howl that tore through the terrified streets of the capital.
It's going to be a massacre. It's going to be a massacre.
Following the pounding of Russ's armored tread came 30,000 wolves, equipped with the most brutal of short-range equipment for urban firefights, from the Terran bolters of the line to the Volkites and plasma guns of Mars, and her forges to the simple blades of Fenris. Acting upon standard Legion practices, the force immediately fragmented into hunting packs, authority delegated through the Legion's fluid and personality-driven command structure. There would be little in the way of a hierarchy for the enemy to disrupt, or to gain access to. The The wolves were as fiercely independent upon the battlefield as they were in temperament, answering only to the word of their direct superiors and that of their king. Initial landing zones were rapidly secured and delivered to Legion hands, allowing for the straggler transports to make hard landings. The area of Tizca in question was its oldest, predating both the arrival of Magnus and the Imperium both. It lacked the palatial squares and impeccable urban planning of the newer reaches of the metropolis, instead being a dense, winding warren of relatively primitive housing, arrayed in no coherent fashion. Tight streets, overhanging roofs, dead-end alleys, scores of potential ways for any defender to bleed and trap an unwitting or unprepared attacker. It was also densely packed with civilians, many of whom had not yet heeded the evacuation orders, and were even now stirring in terror as grey-armored Astartes in furs and blood began to swarm through their once peaceful district.
And you know that civilians tend not to listen until the last second. And by that time, it's too late. It's too late. Now, the Space Wolves are just going to commence a rampage across the city, butchering anyone and everyone they can find. And the 15th Legion is still not moving an inch. They're not budging. Why? Your people, Magnus, are being slaughtered. What are you doing?
The local Spire Guard commander, Caton Aphea, commanded the elite regiments of the Northern Palatine Guard Division, and was rapidly digging in, where possible, to brace his soldiers for the tide he knew would soon arrive. The knowledge of the locale was being lent upon heavily, with choke points and ambush locations prepared, and fallback corridors mapped out. Overall, Aphea was confident that a sufficient delay could be effected against the invaders to allow the bulk of the Spire Guard in the central districts to mobilize and fortify.
Astartes run fast. Astartes have heavy armor. Astartes have devastating weapon systems in their possession. They will bulldoze themselves into your defensive positions. They will bulldoze any form of resistance, especially if it is the 6th Legion that's fighting. They will run over you. They will crush you under their boot. And that is why I'm asking myself, why would Magnus allow this to happen to his people? Why not give himself over to the Centaur host? Why seal himself away and just allowing things like this to occur on his city, on his people, the people who he swore to protect, the people who he claims to love? Yet again, like the Emperor, they make decisions we simply cannot understand. Where does it come from? What is the logic behind it? And they never answer to such important questions. We're just expected just to take it. Just to take it because it's a Primarch. Just to take it because it's the Emperor.
That the maze-like patterns of the old city would help his soldiers retreat in safety if they needed to. They were broken in 2 minutes. Simply put, the tactics employed by the Spire Guard would have been superlative against almost any conventional foe. But the foe was anything but.
Exactly. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Everyone is gone. Yes.
The Legion as Astartes are, thanks to a combination of equipment and biological enhancement, effectively proof against all small arms fire in anything but the most concentrated quantity. Atop this, the 6th Legion specifically had been fighting for 2 centuries as a shock infantry assault force, conducted, as one remembrancer has noted, at a tempo that is literally more than human. The carefully laid out ambushes the Spire Guard hoped to trap the invaders in instead became desperate fights for survival as the wolves simply crashed into each one with near impunity, striding.
This reminds me of that fan-made video called Astartes, And you know how they would depict the Astartes boarding a vessel and just going through the human forces that are defending the ship. You know how they would just use their bolters and just kill. So fast, so efficient. You know, no stopping. It's just continuous pushing forward to their objective. You know, until they fought against the two psychers. This is the type of situation that the human forces on Tesca are dealing with, where the Astartes are just simply relentless, merciless. They will destroy you. You need more firepower. You need the Astartes here too.
Into deluges of small arms fire and butchering those who had moments before believed them surprised. Against any other army, these tactics would have been incisive and demoralizing affairs, bloody traps sprung to bleed the enemy. But against the wolves, they were no impediment at all. The Spire Guard were some of the best trained and equipped auxilia in the Imperium, but the 6th Legion that stalked the stars themselves for 2 centuries to fight and kill the most lethal abominations of the galaxy destroyed them. Against such a thing, a baseline human with a lasgun or light support weapon offered no resistance. The violence meted out against the Spire Guard was monstrous butchery. The regiments of the Palatine Guard found that it was now they, not the invaders, who were trapped in the old city.
And you can imagine, the 15th Legion, you know, they have good hearing. They can hear quite far. They can hear what is going on in that part of the city. They can hear people screaming. They can hear, the soldiers trying their best to defend their city. They can hear everything. They can see it from a distance, you know, as the city slowly burns around them. And they will not budge. They will not move until their Primarch says something. This is your home. This is where you grew up. This is Prospero. And you are being told by your Primarch not to interfere. It must be soul-crushing. It must be truly soul-crushing for the Legion to watch all that they love just die, burn, turn to ash.
They were routed literally within minutes, all resistance crumbling against the sheer ferocity of the Astartes. But the slaughter that ensued went on for more than 15, with the wolves offering absolutely no mercy to those before them. This too extended to the civilians of Prospero, who, seeing the horrors of what was happening around them, fled in catatonic terror alongside the broken soldiery, a tide of humanity streaming out of the old city towards the central district.
Of course, everyone is going to die in this city. Everyone. No one must be left alive. This entire place must come to an end. Yeah, it's terrible.
The alabaster housing of the ancient quarter, once known for shining so brightly in the sun, was drenched in arterial red, as the men of Russ spared none. The estimated military casualties for this initial engagement have been placed at around 10,000, based on the records of Palatine Guard membership, with the civilian toll at least equal to that. All of it taking place in a quarter of an hour, none of it having slowed the wolves one bit. From a coldly strategic point of view, the sheer speed of the assault made sound military sense. The Thousand Sons were still entirely uncommitted, and without anything approaching the numerical superiority typically demanded of a planetary assault operation, the wolves could ill afford to become mired in the type of building-to-building fighting that typified urban conflicts. Speed was of the essence, and if the fury of the assault happened to create a flow of panic and terror that would go on to sow chaos in areas of the city they had not occupied, well, that was a mark in its favor all the same. Innocent casualties be damned. It was in some ways a gamble, though, as it risked the beachhead the wolves had established being attacked in the absence of a proper rearguard. Initially, it paid off, But that was until the 6th Legion reached the Lesma River. Stretching from the coastal areas where the 6th Legion had made planetfall, all the way to the fringes of the central district, the Lemsa River was the demarcation line municipally and geographically for the old city of Tizca. It was a perfect defense cordon, both for anyone seeking to halt the advance of an invading army, and for the invading army themselves to resist what they were assured would be an inevitable counterattack. Ironically enough, considering the almost contemptuous ease by which the wolves had thus far dispatched the soldiery of the Spire Guard, the resistance would come from other baseline humans, members of a regiment of Imperial Auxilia known as the Magdan Free Corps. Upon, it was later discovered, orders of agents of the War Master, the Magdan had been rerouted to Prospero for a resupply, and were encamped in the Palatinate Mansions, an ancient relic of a time when Tizca was ruled by hereditary dynasts. The Free Corps hailed from one of the first worlds brought into compliance following the Great Crusade's initial pushes from the Sol system. They were famed for their unimpeachable loyalty to the throne and the Imperium. As with all upon Prospero, the Free Corps were utterly unaware of the unfolding catastrophe and their place within it, but unlike the Spire Guard, they had plenty of combat experience alongside the forces of the Legiones Astartes. Neither did the commanders of the Censor Host know of the presence of the Free Corps, having been uninformed of their quartering upon Prospero by the intelligence provided by, again, the forces of the War Master.
But, like I said before, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter as long as you are on this planet, you are all condemned. Doesn't matter if you are innocent. If you are in close proximity with the damned, you will die. Because the Imperium of Man does not value human life, really. If an expunge order was given and you were caught in the middle of this entire debacle, you will also die. Yeah.
Acolytes will perhaps expect another Auxilia rout, as baseline human is pitted against the gen-hanced power of the wolves. On the contrary, the boon of serving alongside the Great Crusade for 2 centuries was that the Free Corps had seen precisely how forces equipped similarly to they themselves fared against Astartes. Instead of attempting to futilely meet them in open combat, human versus transhuman, the Magdan instead sought to leverage what weaponry they had at their disposal that they knew would stand some chance against power armor. As the wolves slaughtered their way through the remaining Spire Guard infantry on the banks of the Lemsa, Magdan Malkador battle tanks took positions in the ornamental gardens of the Palatinate.
Malkador has tanks named after him? Malkador the Sigillite? Wow.
Churning priceless flora under fast-moving treads. A concentrated barrage of high-explosive shells tore into the wolves across the water. The 6th Legion's advance was, here, halted. As the wolves of Russ sought cover from the firepower the Magdan were displaying, having roved far ahead of any of their support armor or heavier weaponry, as they glutted their bloodlust on the fleeing Spire Guard. Elsewhere in the city, however, the 6th were still pressing forward at a terrifying pace. Before the Acropolis Magna, the sagas of Fenris first record Russ as engaging in combat, against the masses of terrified civilians and broken auxilia that were attempting to gain access to the relative safety of that old fortress.
It's not combat, it's slaughter. It's not combat, it is slaughter. There's no one that can challenge him. There's no one that can really stand up against him. He's just slaughtering. That's what this is.
And so did the King of Wolves come upon the servants of his warp-touched brother, finding them sealed within the iron hearth that served as their lair, where the raven's friends could not reach with their bright sea flames, The ring breaker of the sixth took hold of the heart's maw, his mighty thews straining at the effort, and it pried asunder, breaking the jaws apart. Across the smashed gullet of the fortress, the steed of midnight, the sons of Fenris, came howling for the blood of the foe, and within the span of heartbeats, there was left only food for the crows. Looking upon the work of his children, the broken corpses of the foe, the Wolf King judged it well and good. What the poem rather floridly describes is the massacre of the Acropolis Magna. Such was the press of civilians outside that the guns of the fort were unable to be turned by its defenders upon the wolves rampaging through the citizenry of Tizca, and once the Primarch had breached the gates, apparently bodily, this hesitation devolved into panic. The Spireguard pummeled the crowds with high-velocity rounds in a vain effort to stymie the advance of the Astartes. While some, including the Spireguard's Seneschal Prime, were successful in leading a group of several thousand civilians out into the White Mountains, the interior of the Acropolis Magna became in no time at all an abattoir. The 1st, 2nd, and 12th...
I'm actually surprised that some civilians got out of the city and went to the mountains when, the entire planet has been engulfed in, virus bombardment. So I would assume that it's quite dangerous to be outside of the city limits where the shield protects, the civilians within that city. Yeah.
Companies of the Wolves, and Russ himself, made absolutely no distinction between civilian and servicemen, massacring any that were within reach with a lack of remorse that was simply inhuman. Several bitter last stands occurred, where what units of the Spireguard that had not succumbed to sheer terror sold their lives as best they could against the invaders. The armory vault was barricaded by some 200 soldiers, all of whom managed an impressive 10-minute stand against cataphractii armored terminators of the 1st 6th Legion Company, before detonating the ammunition dump therein in a final act of defiance, when all had become lost. The surprising restraint that the 6th Legion had shown in its capture and interrogation of orbital vessels had been utterly discarded. These were predators, loose amongst helpless livestock. Beyond the Magdan Free Corps, they had faced no opposition worth noting, nor had taken any casualties worth mentioning, and yet they were inflicting unto Imperial citizenry, innocent ones to boot, atrocities reserved previously for those who had knowingly defied the Emperor's writ.
The innocent be damned. The innocent be damned.
Death came for all who stood before them, inexorable, violent, and pitiless. The 6th Legion were unopposed in the City of Light. The Air Guard had by now been utterly demolished. No Spireguard resistance worth noting yet remained. Heavy ordnance, now finally being landed by the Legion's other companies, took up an artillery refrain, shelling sites of cultural importance as they waited, along with now all of their consolidating brethren, for the emergence of their true foes, the Thousand Sons. With the fall of the Acropolis Magna, the 6th Legion now controlled Old Tizca in its entirety. The Spireguard remained only as pockets of isolated units yet to be overrun by Legion forces, and in the Mansion's Palatinate, 6th Legion armor, Predator and Sikaran battle tanks, engaged the Magdan Free Corps in punishment for its earlier resistance, turning the forests and gardens of the Mansions into an all-out armored engagement, and depriving the Corps of any ability to link up with the Thousand Sons, if and when they emerged. The Magdan fought where they could, pleading with the Wolves over all Vox channels for a ceasefire and talks, but these were, predictably, completely ignored. Likewise ignored were calls from the remainder of the Censure host still in orbit. Constantin Valdor repeatedly hailed the Wolf King with requests to land the rest of Imperial forces, only to have these rebuffed by the truculent Primarch. The Wolf still yet hunted for any sign of his brother and his legion.
And yet somehow we are told that Constantine Valdor can rein in Lehman Russ and his passion for war and conflict and killing. We were told that Constantine Valdo is the only person who can really control Lehman Russ. And here, we are clearly being shown that it's not true. It's not true. Constantine Valdo's opinions are being sidelined, while Lehman Russ continues on his rampage across the city. Yeah.
Whether or not this was done to satisfy Russ's initial oath, fulfilled now by his being the first boots upon the ground, or be it pride or tactical prudence, all is unclear. Certainly there is a lot to be said for an invader not showing their full hand, so to speak, but it is also not unheard of for the ego of the Wolf King to dictate how he comported his campaigning. Regardless, what is certain is that the drawing out of the Thousand Sons was clearly Russ's primary objective at this point in the conflict. Scholars have posited that the butchering of the civilian population was simply a part of this, although one considers it gauche not to acknowledge the heinous barbarism inherent in such wanton, feckless brutality.
These are the acts of a coward. If you want the 15th Legion, go to them. Go to them. They are in the pyramids. Go to them. Fight them there. Leave the civilians alone. If you want to fight Magnus the Red, go to him. Don't kill so many people just to lure him out. It is a plan, and it's seeming to be effective. However, the 15th Legion is not out of their pyramids just yet. But really, I see it as a cowardly act. Destroying the weak and the defenseless. If you were a true, soldier or warrior, you would face against your enemies head on. Not killing and slaughtering civilians.
Certainly, the Wolf King did not wish to force entrance into the fortologies. Much better to draw the 15th out into the open and away from their arcane edifices. For Hukuterika lay within, waiting to be unleashed upon a hapless intruder. The wolves,
but that's the price you will have to take. That's the price you will have to make. Because the people have nothing to do with what Magnus has done. The civilians have nothing to do with it. So deal with the problem, and that is the 15th Legion. Go directly to them. Land near their pyramids. Demand for the arrest of Magnus the Red. If they don't, then you proceed further with, violence to apprehend him. Instead of doing this slaughter.
However, had no alternative at this point but to continue their relentless forward advance towards these arcologies, as no enemy was yet presenting itself. What resistance remained was scant in the extreme, taking the form of a family attempting to defend their property with ancient heirloom firearms. None, of course, lived beyond their initial defiance. Any Prosperine who defied the wolves in any capacity was immediately and mercilessly executed.
I mean, they don't even have to defy. They're just going to die. They're just going to die.
Often, they did not even need to defy. They simply needed to be there. The tempo of the wolves' advance was, however, such that by the time they had reached the foothills of the White Mountains, and their forward units were a mere few kilometers from the Argent Bastion, they were becoming dangerously stretched out. While attempting to run down a retreating Palatine Guard division, a roving pack of grey slayers massed for a final charge on their hapless prey. Yet, as the grey-clad Astartes plunged into what they thought was a rout, they were met with a punishing salvo of not las rounds or auto-rifle rounds, but bolter shells. They found their bodies lashed with tendrils of fire that moved as if alive.
A little too late, but yeah, better late than never. I guess.
And their advance blunted by invisible forces they could not understand. Finally, the Thousand Sons had joined in the defense of Tizca. It has been a topic of frequent and oft impassioned debate, at least for those of us parlayed to the mysteries of the past, as to the inaction of the sons of Magnus during the early period of the Battle of Tizca. Some will claim that the losses they were able to inflict upon the invaders at the time of their emergence would not have been possible unless the wolves had been allowed to run rampant and overextend themselves. This, of course, does not account for the sheer devastation the Sixth Legion wrought upon the city and its populace.
You know, that's a poor strategic move right there. Poor.
The Thousand Sons were rarely noted throughout their loyal history as being callous towards civilians. Quite the opposite, in fact. So the idea that they would use the population of their only city on their only homeworld as human shields sits ill. This misdirection theory does also not account for the absence of the 15th's senior staff during the earliest Legion against Legion engagements. What Vox records that remained recoverable in the aftermath of the burning pointed to a council of the Legion's senior-most figures that was convened even as the bombardment started and the Wolves' first landers smashed onto Prospero's soil. Only through access to the deepest levels of security in one's archives does the truth emerge. Such a council did in fact take place, convened by Magnus himself, wherein he ordered his legion not to engage the censor host at all. Such reasoning, as with all reasoning displayed by the Cyclops during this entire affair, can only be guessed at, but his council appears to have stayed the wrath of his sons during the period heretofore discussed, although not without fractiousness. The captains of the 15th were sharply divided upon the matter, one made all the more pressing as visions and reports of massive civilian losses reached them within the depths of Magnus's great library. The desire to defend their homeworld warred with their loyalty to their Primarch in a way such bonds had never before been tested, locking the leadership into an intense and emotional debate. Ultimately, a cabal of captains led by First Librarian Azek Ahriman revolted against the Primarch's decree, ordering a full mobilization of the Legion, cults and fellowships both, against the censor host.
Despite what you become in the future, Isaac Ahriman, let me just write down your name. Despite what you become in the future, thank you for this. Thank you for trying where your Primarch has failed. Because it just makes no sense. Utterly no sense. Yeah.
And abandoning the dissenters within the Great Library to await the coming of the wolves. The scope of the power wielded by the 15th Legion would become immediately and severely apparent. Their emergence was one from all angles, circumventing the lines the wolves had drawn by powers unknown to the censor host, but of course etheric in nature. Crushing ambushes were now inflicted all across Tizca as the Thousand Sons appeared essentially from thin air to hit the wolves precisely where maximum damage could be inflicted.
Wow, they have teleportation? They can do that? Wow.
The invaders, previously almost casualtyless, suffered staggering losses in this initial wave. In the central districts, the 3rd Company of the 6th lost some 200 Astartes when the Thousand Sons used telekinetic powers to demolish a building they were clearing of retreating Spire Guard. Assault squads of the 8th Company elsewhere found themselves under constant hit-and-run attacks by red-armored Astartes who literally vanished the second they were engaged, only to reappear elsewhere seconds later to wreak yet more havoc. Even the fortified circle of the Vilka Fenrica Stormbirds that served as the initial beachhead came under attack by Thousand Sons from the Order of Blindness, inflicting heavy casualties on the command echelon of the Wolves before retreating after a counterattack led by Grimnir Blackblood and members of Russ's Huskarls. Elsewhere in the metropolis, the Thousand Sons were striking at will. There was no pattern to their assaults, save for the devastating effectiveness they were having. No heed whatsoever was paid towards the Nicaean Edict. The Thousand Sons, as expected, had shucked all pretense of obeying the Emperor's orders in light of the invasion.
I mean, all bets are off now. All bets are off. The gloves are off. They are backed in a corner. So it's no surprise that they would use what is so naturally, something that is so naturally akin to them as the 15th Legion, and that is their psychic powers.
If, indeed, they had paid any heed. Untrammeled sorcery was at their fingertips, and they clearly saw no reason to hold back. For the most powerful, they became conduits for unimaginably destructive etheric powers, living artillery batteries that hurled fire or lightning or earth or simple kinetic force at the wolves, in furious barrages wrought of purest rage. Others obfuscated their presence, or clouded the minds of the foe, or even turned him against his brother, telepathica, sowing confusion and disorder amongst the wolves and giving their fellow legionaries critical tactical advantages in ambushes. Those less bluntly powerful than their fellows utilized the network of portal gates around Tizca, an ancient network, revived and refined by Magnus the Red, that allowed a psyker instantaneous travel between any 2 points in the metropolis.
So that's how they've been able to teleport from one position to the next without being caught by the Space Wolves. That's interesting. That reminds me of Dragon Age Inquisition with the Illuvians. Well, if you know about Dragon Age, then you know what I'm talking about. But essentially, the elves created gates that can be used for instant transportation from one point to the next. And, this magical gates can only be activated by those with magical affinity, if I can say that. And, yeah, really, it's reminding me of those Illuvian gates in Dragon Age Inquisition. Interesting.
Many were housed within buildings or underground, and almost all could even accommodate small armored vehicles. All of it granting the Thousand Sons unparalleled mobility to circumvent any lines the wolves were attempting to hold or draw. These lines, of course, were dissolving under the ferocious assault. Everywhere the 6th Legion was under assault from seemingly all directions at once, with both falling back or advancing presenting seemingly equal peril. Their vox lines were flooded with electronic and psychic interference, a technology the Thousand Sons did not even need thanks to the expertise of the Athenaeans, the Legion's telepaths, who were now relaying orders in perfect clarity to any and all who needed them. Had the Wolves been a legion that relied upon a tightly controlled chain of command, this would have likely been an even more disastrous reversal of fortune than it already was. Luckily for the Fenrisborn, however, theirs was a legion used to autonomy, both at the level of the Great Company and that of the individual squad within it. The Thousand Sons were bleeding them, it was true, but the disruption to communications and coordination would not alone be enough to defeat the 6th. Russ certainly ordered no retreat. Quite the opposite. He reaffirmed with what commanders he could raise on Vox networks that their positions must hold, and that the momentum of the invasion could not falter or be handed to the Thousand Sons. What could at least be established was that the Wolf King had succeeded in one of his primary objectives. He had in fact drawn out the 15th Legion, and despite the continued absence of their Primarch, this was in its own way progress, despite the toll it was taking on his wolves. His front line was, however, in imminent danger of collapse. The reserves, or what had passed for them in a legion as aggressive as the 6th, were summoned for a push by Russ himself that would lead towards the central districts of the city, targeting the temple arcologies of the Pyre and Corvide cults. If these could be captured, it would allow the wolves to claim a perfect forward operating base for an assault on the Great Pyramid of Photep in Oculum Square, within which Russ was convinced his brother yet dwelled. The arcologies...
Photep, right? Okay. Pyramid of Photep.
however, would be no mean feat. 9 in total, 5 of which housed the cults themselves. They were in effect proto-hives, mountainous city structures that were, for the Thousand Sons, barracks, librariums, archives, training facilities, armories, and defensive fortifications, all in one. The majority of the city's population was housed within 8 of them, and, should an emergency strike, their cavernous lower levels could shelter many, many more. While the Corvidae were amongst the less martial of the fivefold cults, the Pyrae were another matter entirely, consisting of the most bellicose of the Legion Psychers and a great many of those that were inducted into the Order of Ruin. The hammer that fell on Central Tizca was led by Russ's Varigir Terminator elite from the 6th First Great Company, supported by the Pale Hunter bands and armoured columns of the 2nd and 3rd Great Companies. Reports of the Thousand Sons engaging the wolves elsewhere in the city, and forward scouts reporting minimal to no ground presence of the Legion in the path of this offensive, gave Russ some confidence that resistance may be minimal. He was mistaken. The opposition was dug in, prepared, and furious. Elite divisions of the Prosperine Spire Guard, fresh from defensive positions within the Temple Arcologies, had fortified all approaches, learning from the blood spilled in the Old Quarter to throw only their heaviest weaponry at the attacking Astartes from the safest and most defensible positions available.
Good, very good.
The real game-changer for the Auxilia were, of course, the presence of the Thousand Sons. Many of the units encountered by the wolves bore the same markings as those the scattered Vox logs had placed in other, further reaches of the city, causing confusion and angst amongst the wolves as to how such a thing was even possible, the 6th being utterly unaware of the nature of how the 15th Legion was traversing their home turf.
Imagine this technology could have been used for the Imperium of Man. These portals that that can teleport you from one point to the next. If they could have adopted this technology throughout the entire Imperium of Man, we won't need to use the warp for travel. Especially when it comes to civilians, when it comes to trading, and even the Astartes. If this network could have been developed throughout the entire galaxy where the Imperium of Man has a foothold or presence, it would have been so much easier for forces, for civilians, for trade to expand throughout the entire galaxy. But this technology, this innovation, this knowledge is about to be crushed, destroyed. What could have been? What could have been?
Sons were supported in their efforts by the battle automata yet unencountered by the invaders, bespoke Castellax Achaea marks constructed for the Legion by the Mechanicum of Shao Arkad. Augmented by psychically sensitive crystalline cortex matrices, these Castellax were controllable by almost any psyker within range, and possessed a certain amount of free will themselves.
That's impressive. That's really impressive. It reminds me of the Eldar and their, automatons, if I can say that. Those that are controlled by a what did they call it? A soul gem. I think that's what they call it. I forgot what the Eldar call it. That gem that holds their soul, so that it's not consumed by Slanesh. And they use those gems, if I could say that, and they place it into their titans or into their equivalents of dreadnought class automatons, if I can say that. Yeah. Okay. Very interesting.
Becoming in effect far more responsive and lethal than the cruder marks employed by those bound by strict Martian dogma. This would no doubt have raised rancor amongst Imperial elements if such a thing was not eclipsed by the far greater crimes of psychic utilization the Thousand Sons were already wantonly displaying. But regardless, the automata were reaping a fearsome tally of kills amongst the attackers with their molar bolt cannons. This new front was now seeing the most vicious fighting of the battle emerge yet. Massive concentrations of Legionnaires Astartes and their supporting elements were clashing across a huge theatre. Such a conflict between Astartes had never before been recorded in Imperial history. Even the ferocity that the wolves have evinced during the redacted confrontation between them and the 12th Legion World Eaters was a skirmish compared to the destruction that both legions were unleashing upon each other. Russ committed over 20,000 of his Astartes to the push. The 1,000 Suns more than met him in numbers, even before the force-multiplying effects of their Psyker talents were accounted for. Tizca was being torn asunder as erstwhile brother met erstwhile brother, and both sides tore into each other with all the hatred and pain of transhumans betrayed. The intent of the wolves since planetfall had been to tear down the great works of Magnus, to burn his libraries, demolish his theaters, crush the culture of his world under ceramite boots. And now the sons of the Crimson King turned what had been spared from the fury of the wolves into shot and fire-blasted ruins in their desire for revenge. In the northern reaches, the wolves of the 8th and 12th Great Companies came under renewed assault by the Order of Blindness, freed now from their abortive assault on the 6th Legion's beachhead. A bloody gambit of ambush and counter-ambush emerged, all of it in the favor of the psychic infiltrators of the 1,000 Suns. Using perceptual psychana to mask their movements and misdirect the invaders, the several 100,000 Suns tied down almost 10,000 wolves from linking up with their comrades, bleeding the great companies in every engagement and taking next to no casualties in return. The battle for the manors yet continued too, with the Magdan Free Corps continuing to resist the invaders through the now devastated ornamental gardens. Their proverbial backs against the wall, all restraint that may once have been the pride of the 1,000 Suns was completely discarded. Knowing redemption was forever beyond their grasp, Psychana, unlike anything the Imperium had ever seen, was now being released across Tizca to brutal effect.
I'm sure the Chaos Gods are loving what they're seeing here. And demons, of course. They're going to penetrate through the Materium world because of this conflict. And probably they're going to try and possess Astartes, and they're going to use them for their own personal needs. And also the Astartes themselves, as they descend further into madness or into the desperation of trying to protect their home, they are also going to, commit chaos-related acts.
Lightning, the color of pain itself, speared from the now churning sky. The earth erupted in deluges of rock and metal. Iridescent flames wormed through Tizcan streets, hunting wolves like a predator. Attackers meeting defenders found themselves pummeled by invisible force, or saw their brothers sliced by invisible blades, unseen forces shearing through power armor as if it was paper. The bodies of the wolves rebelled against them, locking bone and sinew in place, or causing their flesh to run like wax and their organs to boil inside their chest cavities. The deluge of psychic energy now coalescing around the city was forming a vortex, and the veil between Prospero and the Impeterium was wearing thin. This was not immediately apparent.
And when you also consider that the flesh change is still affecting the 15th Legion, as more of them continue to delve deeper into their abilities, they are just going to lead themselves to their own demise. As the flesh change suppression that was created by Zinch is uplifted, they're going to be consumed by their powers, and they're going to die, many of them.
But as the battle progressed, the sky only darkened further, and the ground began to quake, seemingly of its own volition. Cracks rent buildings, and a dread unlike anything the Astartes fighting had ever experienced fell upon them. Unmistakable, unignorable, eating away at their humors and driving their fury and hatred to new heights. The battle did not abate. If anything, it just built, the intensity climbing. The Thousand Sons deployed more and more units through their portal network, now seeking to press the flanks of the Wolves' offensive and cut the First Company off from its beachhead, and what little reserves the Wolves still possessed. This course of action was broad, and as such could not go unnoticed by any who were watching. In orbit, eyes were scrying the unfolding situation, as aboard the flagship of the Legio Custodes, the mighty Auric Oriflame, Constantin Valdor was demanding updated reports from whatever sensorium suites were still functioning. The aetheric squall building over Tizca was rendering intelligence less verifiable by the minute. Russ was completely uncontactable, both due to the interference on the comms and his preoccupation essentially fighting for his life. Neither, too, was the Legio Mortis raisable, the demi-maniple of Titans sent to attack the Mechanicum Forge Fane on the city's outskirts, having disappeared entirely from sensor screens.
How is that possible? How is that possible that they've just vanished like that? That's very concerning. Very concerning.
It was clear that should the Legio Custodes and the Sisters of Silence delay intervention further, the Wolves would suffer, and the invasion would be put at dire risk. Yet doing so would of course countermand a direct order to remain in orbit from the censor host's supreme commander. Judging discretion...
Everyone is doing their own thing, Constantin Valdor. So you do your own thing as well. Yeah.
To be the better part of valor, the Captain General ordered a drop in force. Not to reinforce the Wolves on any particular front, but to open up another, directing the Legio Custodes and Silent Sisterhood to open combat operations at Tizca's orbital transfer docklands. This would, Valdor coolly reasoned, spare the Wolf King any wounded pride, and spare the Captain General any wasted time for having to placate the Primarch's ego, neither of which the censor host could afford at this critical moment. 36 sodalities were deployed, alongside the 9th Solar Auxilia regiments and an unnumbered series of Silent Sisterhood hunter cadres, all dropping from orbit conventionally, as fears of the city's Kinney shield interfering with teleportation were well reasoned. The drop was not uncontested. The remaining Thousand Sons air defense units, now primarily made up of Lightning interceptors, attempted runs on the sleek Custodes gunships and ponderous Auxilia landers, claiming several of each before Equinox fighters disintegrated them in return. Over 1,000 Solar Auxilia and several Custodians perished in the planetfall, but those that survived moved swiftly to consolidate their gains. Reports before communications had collapsed spoke of the speed of Thousand Sons redeployment, and the Custodes sodalities were fully aware that a new front opening up on their flanks would elicit a rapid response. Assignments for the capture of the starport were direct. The sodalities of the Emperor's own life wards made a direct line for the control tower in Coronus transports, supported by Palace grav tanks that tore into Spireguard armored squadrons with utter impunity. The Solar cohorts, meanwhile, focused on seizing the starport's defensive fortifications, Void Hoplites sections clearing interiors that their rapier laser track batteries had broken open. The professionalism displayed by the Saturnine Auxilia was impressive, but it stood as nothing compared to that of the Custodes when they reached their target. The command tower fell in minutes. Other military bodies trained squads for coherent, supportive work. The Custodes simply do not need to. Each warrior, an artifice of the Emperor himself, is an army unto his own.
Devastating. Absolutely devastating.
They move and fight as individuals, trusting training and enhanced senses to respond to the needs of their comrades, should they arise. Where the Spire Guard had engaged the Wolves, the result was butchery. Where they met the Emperor's Auric warriors, it was a similar rout, but one conducted with a clean, detached professionalism that was monstrous in a completely different fashion. The Custodes were simply unstoppable. Not a single warrior fell in the capture of the Space Force. Until, that is, they faced Astartes' defenders. At the spire of the command tower, the sodalities under Valdor encountered the warriors of the Sekhmet. These cataphractii-armoured warriors were the Terminator elite of the Thousand Sons, the warders of Magnus the Red, and formidable psychers all, forming an almost gestalt consciousness when deployed together. The clash was on a scale only possible through the transhumanity of all involved. The first custodians to fall upon Prospero did so here, in the bloody confine, and the man...
Wow. I never expected some custodians to fall. But here it is. It's happening.
The man in question took 3 of the Sekhmet to bring him down. This pattern was repeated as the combat intensified. For all the elite experience and psychic craft of the Thousand Sons Terminators, those they faced were elevated above them even higher on the artificial human evolutionary path envisaged and wrought by the Emperor. Each golden warrior that fell exacted 4 times that number in Sekhmet casualties. Their psyker talents were a potent force to reckon with, yet as the battle for the tower reached its pinnacle, the Terminators suddenly found themselves robbed of it. Summoned by the Custodes, the Null Maidens of the Silent Sisterhood, pariah blanks that stole the power of the warp from all around them.
This tag team is the most dangerous for the 15th Legion. This tag team between Sisters of Silence and the Custodians, it's just nightmare. It's just a nightmare for them. Yeah.
Had arrived, and with this arrival, the fate of the Sekhmet was sealed. The remaining Terminators were overwhelmed by the Custodes, suffering a defeat like nothing the formation had ever endured, and at the hands of a foe that would not even note such a victory as worthy of comment. Merely a dispassionate acknowledgement that an objective had been secured. With the docks in Censor Host hands, Valdor delayed the orbital reserves not a moment longer. The remainder of the host's soldiery was ordered to land immediately and at full combat readiness, be they Silent Sisters, Legio Custodes, Imperial Auxilia, or Mechanicum. The Astartes elements, however, largely elected to remain for the Wolf King summons. This extended to not only the majority of the wolves still in Prosperine skies, but the contingent of Sons of Horus Astartes that had joined the host at Beta Garman. That being said, the 13th Great Company, bloodthirsty for the enemy, and the 11th, those of the so-called Black Cull that had fallen to psychotic battle hunger, elected to join the Captain General on this new front, leaving the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 9th Companies in reserve, alongside the Sons of Horus and the Ebony Titan barks of the Ordo Sinister. Valdor highlighted what he deemed to be the most important of immediate concerns. 2 objectives. The first, a push northward through the Palatinate mansions, destroying the remainder of the Magdan Free Corps in the process, and linking up with the embattled Leman Russ and his first wave. The second objective was an advance eastwards, to seize the Great Sesaustrian Canal. This latter move would allow forward passage onto the pyramids of the Domus Tenebrae and the Praeferium Aeternus at the city's centre. What resistance barred this path as it currently stood was scattered and half-mad with losses sustained. The Spire Guard had ceased to function in any coherent capacity, but had, thanks to their mauling at the hands of the wolves, begun to refuse any Imperial demands of surrender, knowing that to do so was death anyway. Pickets of Tizkin units were thus strung out along the path Valdor was electing to take, but none would bar the path of the rapidly deploying Censor Host, be they Solar Auxilia or Legio Custodes. Valdor knew that the Thousand Sons would intervene, that as their Psychana gave them unparalleled mobility, their actions could not be planned for beyond reactionary retaliations if and when they emerged. Regardless, Captain General had laid out a course that would see another Imperial offensive drive straight into the city's heart, and it was his hope that this would bring about a swift and decisive end to the Battle of Prospero. Of course, would that it were so simple.
Okay guys, yeah. That is the complete history of the burning of Prospero, Warhammer 40k and Horus Heresy lore made on the Oculus Imperia YouTube channel, part 2. And yeah, we've begun the assault on Prospero. The Censor Host has bombarded the planet with exterminatus weapons, and Leman Russ has decided to, go down there personally with his legion to lure out the 15th Legion and their Primarch by destroying public infrastructure, killing civilians, destroying the human auxiliary forces. And while it has drawn out some members of the 15th Legion, especially led by Ahriman, but still Magnus is holding himself up in his pyramid of Photep, and a lot more people are going to die, a lot more infrastructure is going to be destroyed, just so that this man can finally reveal himself to the Center Host. So I just don't understand the reasoning of Magnus. Why didn't he surrender himself to the Center Host the moment they started orbiting his homeworld, so that Prospero does not end up in the situation that it is in right now? Why did he not give up? Why did he not allow himself to be arrested and to be taken back to Terra? And it's a question that no one is going to be able to answer. Only him. Only he can answer that question. And like I've said before, like the Emperor, these two are very confusing individuals. Very confusing. Especially with the decisions that they make. And like I also said before, the forces on Prospero are formidable. However, the variety of forces being brought by the Center Host is completely overwhelming, and it's clearly evident here. As the Spire Guards and other auxiliary forces were just run over by the 6th Legion. They were destroyed, they were smashed. And also the Magdan Free Corps, they were also overwhelmed by the forces of the 6th Legion. And now Constantine Valdor and his forces are also landing on the planet. There is no escape for this. There is no way of turning this around for the 15th Legion. And that's why they've also decided just to allow themselves to descend into their psychic abilities, to use them to the fullest effect without restrictions, without mental discipline. They're just allowing themselves to be engorged in their power. And like I said before, this is going to result in many of them succumbing to the flesh change. This is going to result in many of them being possessed by demons as the Immaterium and the Materium world begin to converge in this battlefield, as the veil is uplifted. So really, the 15th Legion is doomed to extinction as we know it. Of course, yes, there are some who survive through this entire purge of Prospero, but they won't be the same. They won't be the same. They'll be shattered as a legion, shattered as a people. And it's just sad, really. The decisions made by Leman Russ and how he conducts his war on Prospero, it's just terrible. Terrible. If he wanted Magnus, like I said before, he should have went directly for the pyramid where Magnus the Red is held up. He should have went there with the Captain General. He should have went there with the Sisters of Silence and a few of his own bodyguards, because they've allowed the Center Host to reach all the way to Prospero. So the fact that he resorted to bombarding the planet with exterminatus weapons, really, it was a mistake. He should have just went directly to the pyramids and collected Magnus. But anyways, what's done is done. It's too late now. This planet is burning, and the city is burning, and the people, the culture that they have created is also going to burn. So yeah, guys, that's it with part 2. And I feel extremely tired, and my throat really hurts, but I wanted to make this video as soon as possible before I just take a rest and just recuperate from this illness. But yeah, this was good. This was sad, but it was good to finally understand what's going on Prospero. Yeah, during that, the burning of Prospero, I mean. And guys, that's it. Remember, if you want to check out the original video as well as Oculus Imperia's YouTube channel, the links are going to be in the description below. If you like my reaction, please give me a like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Click on the notification bell if you want to be up to date with my latest videos. And I will see you guys next time for part 3. Yeah. Alright. Bye-bye.